thing.
Thank you.
You do write, though, that this tabloid scandal, in fact, you almost feel thankful for it. It let you, I don't know, review your life, see where you were.
At exactly 8:17 this morning, Buckingham Palace released a statement that sent shockwaves through the royal world. The Duchess of York will no longer receive any support, provision, or accommodation from the Crown, effective immediately. The announcement was brief, clinical, and devastatingly final, marking the end of Sarah Ferguson's nearly 40-year connection to the royal family. What forced the palace to take such drastic action, and what does this mean for a woman who has already lost so much? What will happen to her now? The announcement that shattered everything. The notification arrived without warning, without the usual diplomatic softening that typically cushions even the harshest royal decisions. At 8:17 on the morning of Tuesday, December 2, 2025, Palace correspondents received a message so blunt it left even the most experienced journalists momentarily speechless. Following comprehensive review, the royal household confirms that Sarah, Duchess of York, will no longer receive residential support, security provisions, or financial accommodations from the Crown. This decision, effective immediately, reflects the necessary modernization of royal resources and responsibilities. That was all it took to sever a connection that had endured through marriage, divorce, scandal, bankruptcy, and decades of public scrutiny. No expression of gratitude for past service, no acknowledgement of her role as mother to two princesses, no softening phrase about mutual agreement or natural transition, just a cold institutional declaration that Sarah Ferguson was out, completely and irrevocably. The reaction across Britain was immediate and conflicted. What the statement didn't say was equally significant. There was no mention of Sarah's charitable work, no acknowledgement of her decades-long dedication to various causes, no reference to her role as grandmother to August, Sienna, and Ernest. The omissions spoke louder than the included text, suggesting the palace wanted to create maximum distance with minimum sentiment. Inside Royal Lodge, where Sarah had lived for over 20 years, staff reported that she had been in the morning room when the announcement went live. According to sources close to the household, she had received no advance warning beyond a brief formal notification, approximately 30 minutes before the public statement. The call had come from a senior palace official, not from Charles, not from William, not even from Anne. Just a procedural heads-up that her world was about to change irrevocably. One staff member, who had served the York household since the early 2000s, later described the atmosphere as eerily silent. There was no crying, no shouting, no dramatic reaction, just a terrible, heavy quiet that settled over the house like frost. By 9:30, international news agencies had picked up the story. Reuters, Associated Press, and Agence France Presse all ran detailed reports analyzing the implications. Several noted that this was the most definitive action the palace had taken against a non-working royal family member in recent memory, more severe even than the initial restrictions placed on Prince Harry and Meghan when they stepped back in 2020. Royal historians contacted for comment struggled to find comparable precedents. One pointed to the treatment of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor after the abdication crisis of 1936, but even that comparison felt imperfect. Edward had chosen to leave. Sarah was being pushed out. The palace had made its decision, and the language made clear there would be no reversal. As the morning progressed and the shock began settling into analysis, one question dominated every conversation, every news segment, every social media thread. What had Sarah Ferguson done to warrant such complete and immediate severance from the royal family? The answer, as it turned out, wasn't a single dramatic incident, but an accumulation of concerns that had been building for years, warnings that had been issued and ignored, and a final misstep that convinced the palace there was no path forward except complete separation. The years of warnings. Nobody heeded. To understand why the palace moved so decisively on December 3rd, we must return to the slow accumulation of problems that had been building around Sarah Ferguson since 2023, problems that individually seemed manageable, but collectively created a situation the monarchy could no longer tolerate. The first serious warning sign emerged in the spring of 2024, when Sarah's financial situation, which had appeared stable for several years, began showing cracks again. She had rebuilt her reputation carefully after the catastrophic debt and scandal of the early 2000s, establishing herself as a children's author, occasional television personality, and charity advocate. But those income streams, never particularly robust, had weakened considerably as she aged past her mid-60s. Palace officials monitoring the situation, something they did quietly with all family members who lived on crown properties, noticed concerning patterns. Payments for Royal Lodge expenses were arriving later and later. Staff salaries that Sarah was responsible for covering were occasionally delayed. Small creditors began making discreet inquiries about outstanding invoices. None of this would have mattered significantly if Sarah had been a private citizen living in her own property, but she wasn't. She was residing in a crown estate property, occupying space that cost the royal household substantial amounts in maintenance and security, and her financial instability created potential complications the palace desperately wanted to avoid. By summer of 2024, senior advisors had begun raising concerns with King Charles. Not formally, not with urgent memos, but in the careful, oblique way palace business is often conducted. Observations were made. Questions were gently posed. The subtext was clear. Sarah's presence at Royal Lodge had always been somewhat anomalous. She held no title of Her Royal Highness, performed no official duties, and represented a past era the monarchy was actively trying to move beyond. If her financial situation was deteriorating again, perhaps it was time to revisit the arrangement. Charles, loyal to family and particularly sympathetic to Sarah, given their long shared history, resisted these suggestions. He pointed out that she was the mother of his nieces, that she had endured decades of unfair treatment from the press, and that removing her from Royal Lodge would be unnecessarily cruel, especially while Andrew was already facing his own relocations and restrictions. But then came the second problem, one far more damaging than financial instability. In August of 2024, American congressional investigators looking into remaining questions about Jeffrey Epstein's network released a new tranche of documents. Buried within hundreds of pages was Sarah's infamous email from 2011, the one in which she had referred to Epstein as a dear friend and thanked him for his generosity. The email had surfaced before, but in the context of the new investigation, it gained renewed and intensified attention. American media, particularly networks targeting older viewers who had followed the Epstein scandal closely, replayed the email repeatedly. Commentary grew increasingly critical, questioning how anyone connected to the royal family could have maintained such friendly correspondence with a convicted offender. British media followed suit, with several major newspapers running retrospective pieces on Sarah's judgment failures. The tone wasn't sympathetic. After everything the country had learned about Epstein, after all the pain his victims had endured, Sarah's historical association with him became not just embarrassing but morally problematic in ways the palace could not easily dismiss. Princess Anne raised the issue directly during a family meeting at Balmoral on September 20, 24. She pointed out with her characteristic bluntness that the monarchy could not afford to appear tolerant of anyone who had maintained friendly relations with predators, regardless of when those relations occurred or how they had been explained. The institution's credibility on safeguarding and moral authority depended on drawing clear, unambiguous lines. William, present at the same meeting, supported Anne's position. He had grown increasingly concerned about reputational vulnerabilities, particularly as he looked ahead to his own future reign. Every person associated with the royal family, even tangentially, affected public perception of the institution. And Sarah, with her history of financial chaos and poor judgment, represented exactly the kind of loose thread he believed the monarchy could no longer afford. The third problem was Andrew himself. By autumn of 2024, Prince Andrew's position had deteriorated to the point where he was being relocated from Royal Lodge to a smaller property at Sandringham. The move was presented as a practical downsizing, but everyone understood it was another step in his ongoing removal from public royal life. Sarah's continued presence at Royal Lodge complicated this transition. She had no official reason to be there once Andrew left. She held no lease, no formal arrangement, no institutional justification for occupying one of the Crown's most significant properties. The longer she remained, the more her presence looked like an oversight, an informal allowance that had somehow persisted beyond its natural conclusion. Palace administrators preparing the Royal Lodge transition began presenting options to senior royals. The property could be fully renovated and repurposed. It could become a residence for working royals. It could even be partially opened for heritage tours. But all of those options required Sarah to leave, and no one seemed willing to have that conversation directly with her. The mounting pressure came from multiple directions, simultaneously. William's office was producing regular briefings showing public opinion data, suggesting that viewers, particularly older ones in both the UK and United States, were growing increasingly uncomfortable with the York family's ambiguous status. They weren't working royals, yet they lived in royal properties and benefited from Crown resources. The inconsistency troubled people who valued clarity and fairness in institutional arrangements, and continued pressing the case that Sarah represented a reputational liability the family could not afford during a period of necessary modernization. But Sarah, either unaware of the gathering storm or unwilling to acknowledge it, continued living at Royal Lodge, continued attending occasional family events, and continued presenting herself as a member, however informal, of the royal circle. She had survived scandals before. She had rebuilt her reputation after devastating collapses. Perhaps she believed she could weather this period of tension, as she had weathered all the others. She was wrong, because this time the warnings were not coming from the tabloids or from public opinion, or from financial pressures she could potentially negotiate. They were coming from within the institution itself, from the people who controlled her access to royal life. And when the palace decided someone had become more liability than asset, history had shown, the removal could be swift, decisive, and irreversible. When the last straw finally broke. The incident that sealed Sarah Ferguson's fate occurred on October 19, 2025, during what should have been a minor, barely noticed public appearance. But sometimes the smallest missteps have the largest consequences, and for Sarah, this particular afternoon would prove catastrophic. She had been invited to speak at a charity event in London, a book launch for a children's literacy organization she had supported for years. It was the kind of engagement Sarah did regularly, comfortable territory where her warmth and relatability usually served her well. The event wasn't even particularly high profile. A few dozen people in attendance, local media coverage at best, nothing that should have generated palace concern. But during the informal question and answer session following her remarks, someone in the audience asked about her perspective on the modern royal family and whether she felt the institution was successfully adapting to contemporary expectations. It was a gentle question, the kind Sarah had fielded countless times before. But something in the phrasing, or perhaps the accumulation of months of strain and uncertainty about her own position, caused her to answer with unusual candor. She said the royal family was indeed modernizing, though sometimes that modernization felt more like exclusion than evolution. She mentioned carefully but clearly that there seemed to be an increasing emphasis on drawing boundaries between who was considered properly royal and who was merely adjacent to the institution. She even made a light, self-deprecating reference to feeling like she existed in royal purgatory, not quite in, not quite out, forever waiting for clarity about her actual status. The comments were not angry, they were not accusatory, but they were revealing, and in the careful world of royal communication, revelation without authorization is one of the gravest sins. A reporter from a mid-level British newspaper happened to be in attendance. The quotes made it into a short article the following morning, and within hours they had been picked up and amplified across social media and international outlets. American morning shows ran segments analyzing what Sarah's comments revealed about tension within the royal family. British commentators debated whether her words constituted legitimate grievance or inappropriate public airing of private family dynamics. Inside Buckingham Palace, the reaction was swift and severe. William's communications team flagged the coverage immediately, noting that Sarah had essentially confirmed the existence of internal divisions and uncertainty about her status, subjects the palace desperately wanted to keep private. Princess Anne, reviewing the clips, was characteristically direct in her assessment. Sarah had violated the first rule of royal adjacency: you do not discuss internal family dynamics publicly, ever, regardless of how unfairly you feel you have been treated. King Charles, caught between sympathy for Sarah and recognition that she had indeed crossed a line, requested a meeting with her for October 24th. The conversation was held at Clarence House, private and brief. Charles explained gently but firmly that her comments had created complications, that speaking publicly about feeling excluded or uncertain suggested dissatisfaction with how the family was handling her situation, and that such dissatisfaction, once aired, became very difficult to manage. He warned her, not harshly but seriously, that she needed to be more careful going forward. The palace was under enormous scrutiny. Every word from anyone connected to the royal family was analyzed and weaponized. She could not afford further public missteps. Sarah apologized. She claimed the comments had been misinterpreted, taken out of context, that she had meant nothing negative by them. But the apology, sincere though it may have been, could not undo the damage. The royal meeting, the one where Sarah's fate was truly sealed, occurred on November 15th at Windsor Castle. Present were King Charles, Prince William, Princess Anne, and two senior legal advisors who specialized in royal household arrangements. The meeting's ostensible purpose was to review residential situations across various crown properties as part of ongoing estate management. But everyone present understood the real agenda, determining what to do about Sarah Ferguson. William opened the discussion by presenting data his team had compiled. Public polling showed increasing discomfort with the York family's status. Media coverage analysis demonstrating that Sarah's name appeared predominantly in negative or embarrassing contexts. Financial projections showing the cost of maintaining security and support for someone who performed no official duties and generated no positive institutional value. The presentation was professional, data-driven, and devastating in its cumulative impact. By the time William finished, the conclusion was inescapable. Sarah had become a net liability, and the monarchy could no longer justify subsidizing that liability. Anne added that the October incident had demonstrated Sarah either could not or would not maintain the discretion required of anyone connected to the royal family. If she felt comfortable making those comments at a small charity event, what might she say during a larger media opportunity or, worse, in a future book or interview if financial pressure increased? Charles listened quietly, his expression pained. He raised objections, pointed out Sarah's positive qualities, noted her dedication to her daughters. But even as he spoke, he seemed to understand his arguments were insufficient. The institution's needs had to outweigh personal loyalty, and the institution needed Sarah Ferguson removed from royal provision. The legal advisors confirmed that the palace had full authority to terminate her residential arrangement and all associated support. She held no formal title beyond Duchess of York, a courtesy that could not be removed, but carried no entitlement to royal resources. Legally, the decision was straightforward. Charles listened to both arguments without interruption. When they finished, he sat in silence for nearly a minute before speaking. He acknowledged that everything they said was factually correct and institutionally sound. He understood the polling data, recognized the consistency problem, and accepted that continued support for Sarah created complications the palace could not easily explain. But he also reminded them that Sarah was not simply an administrative problem. She was the mother of Beatrice and Eugénie, women he loved and who had remained close to the family despite their father's disgrace. Removing all support from Sarah would devastate them, potentially damaging relationships that had survived extraordinary strain. He also noted quietly that Sarah had endured decades of brutal treatment from the press and public, much of it grossly unfair. Yes, she had made mistakes, serious ones, but she had also been held to standards that others, particularly men in the family, had not faced. There was something that troubled him about casting her out so completely, particularly at her age, when starting over would be exceptionally difficult. William responded carefully, acknowledging his father's concerns, but pointing out that sentiment could not guide institutional decision-making. The palace had extended extraordinary tolerance to Sarah for years, allowing her to remain in royal proximity long after her divorce, overlooking financial scandals and poor judgment, permitting her to maintain connections that would have been severed for anyone else. That tolerance, well-intentioned though it was, had created the current impossible situation. Charles asked whether there was any middle path, any arrangement that might satisfy institutional requirements while showing basic compassion for someone who had been part of the family for 4 decades. Could they not provide modest financial assistance or help her secure alternative housing without maintaining the formal royal connection that created so many complications? William shook his head. Half measures would solve nothing. Sarah would remain in royal proximity, continue to be perceived as receiving crown support, and the fundamental problem of her ambiguous status would persist. The only way forward that achieved the necessary clarity was complete separation, removing all support and making unmistakably clear that she was no longer part of the royal framework in any capacity. The room fell silent. The winter afternoon light filtering through the tall windows had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the polished table. As the meeting concluded and participants prepared to leave, one of the legal advisors asked about the specific date for the public announcement. William suggested December 3rd, giving them adequate time to finalize documentation, while ensuring the matter was resolved before the Christmas season dominated all royal coverage. No one objected. December 3rd, it would be. In 11 days, Sarah Ferguson would learn that her connection to the royal family, already strained and informal, was being terminated completely and publicly. The decision nobody wanted to make had been made, and now there was nothing left but to execute it. Sarah's world collapses. Sarah Ferguson was sitting in the morning room at Royal Lodge on December 2nd, going through correspondence and planning her schedule for the coming weeks, when her phone rang at 7:43 in the evening. The caller identification showed a Buckingham Palace number she didn't immediately recognize, but royal family members grew accustomed to receiving calls from various palace extensions, so she answered without concern. The voice on the other end belonged to a senior private secretary, someone Sarah had met perhaps twice in formal settings, but certainly did not know personally. That should have been her first warning. When the palace needs to deliver difficult news, they send people with whom you have no emotional connection. The secretary was professionally courteous, but notably brief. He informed Sarah that a statement regarding her residential and support arrangements would be released publicly the following morning at 8:17. He explained that this notification was being provided as a courtesy to allow her time to prepare, but that the decision was final and not subject to discussion or appeal. Sarah felt something cold spreading through her chest. She asked what exactly the statement would say, and the secretary read it to her verbatim. The words "effective immediately" and "no longer received support" seemed to echo in her ears long after he finished speaking. She asked if there had been some mistake, whether this decision had actually been authorized by the king, and the secretary confirmed that it had been reviewed and approved at the highest levels. The call lasted less than 4 minutes. When it ended, Sarah sat motionless, phone still pressed to her ear even after the line had gone dead. The morning room, with its familiar furniture and soft lighting, suddenly felt alien, as though she were seeing it for the first time, or perhaps for the last time. Her first reaction was not grief or anger, but profound disbelief. This could not be happening, not after 40 years. Not after everything she had endured and survived. Not now, when she was 66 years old and had finally found some measure of stability and peace. The palace could not, simply discard her with a 4-minute phone call and a public statement. But even as she tried to convince herself this was somehow a misunderstanding, a deeper part of her recognized the truth. The palace absolutely could do this, and they were going to do it, and there was nothing she could do to stop them. She remained in the morning room for nearly an hour, her mind racing through fragmented thoughts and half-formed plans that all dissolved upon examination. She could call Charles directly, but if the decision had been approved at the highest levels, he already knew and had agreed. She could refuse to leave Royal Lodge, but she held no legal right to the property, and forcing an eviction would only add public humiliation to institutional rejection. By 9 o'clock, the initial shock had begun transforming into something rawer and more painful. Her hands started shaking, making it difficult to hold her phone steady as she scrolled through her contacts, trying to decide who to call first. She needed to tell her daughters before they learned about it from tomorrow's announcement, but forming the words felt impossible. How do you tell your children that their mother has been officially cast out of the family they were born into? She called Beatrice first. Her eldest daughter answered on the third ring, and the concern in her voice was immediate. Sarah tried to speak calmly, tried to explain what she had just been told, but her voice broke halfway through the first sentence. What emerged instead was a gasping, choking sound that frightened them both. Beatrice, alarmed, asked repeatedly what was wrong, whether Sarah was hurt, whether she needed medical help. Finally, Sarah managed to force out the essential information. The palace was removing all support. The announcement would be public tomorrow morning. She had to leave Royal Lodge. Everything was ending. The silence on the other end of the line lasted several seconds before Beatrice responded, her own voice tight with barely controlled emotion. She said she would call Eugenie immediately, that they would both come to Royal Lodge that night, that Sarah should not be alone right now. She also said, with a fury Sarah rarely heard from her typically diplomatic daughter, that this was unconscionable, that William and Anne had pushed too far, and that there had to be some way to fight this decision. But Sarah knew better. There was no fighting the palace once it had made up its institutional mind. She had learned that lesson over decades of watching others try and fail. When the monarchy decided someone had to go, they went. After ending the call with Beatrice, Sarah tried to call Eugenie but couldn't complete the connection. Her hands were shaking too badly to control the phone properly. She set it down on the side table and walked to the window, staring out at the darkened grounds of Royal Lodge, the property that had been her home for over 20 years and would soon belong to someone else. By 10:30, both Beatrice and Eugenie had arrived, having driven from London with remarkable speed. They found their mother still standing at the window, her face composed but her eyes distant, as though she had retreated somewhere inside herself where the pain could not quite reach. Beatrice kept insisting there must be something they could do, someone they could appeal to, some way to at least delay the announcement until alternative arrangements could be made privately. Eugenie, more pragmatic, had already begun making phone calls to friends and connections, trying to identify potential housing options and financial assistance, recognizing that the practical problems would need immediate attention once the announcement became public. But with each call, the reality of their mother's situation became clearer. Sarah had no significant savings, no property of her own, and a reputation so complicated that even sympathetic friends hesitated before offering concrete help. Around midnight, Sarah finally spoke with real clarity. She told her daughters that she knew this had been coming, even if she had refused to fully acknowledge it. She had felt the palace pulling away for months, noticed the increasing coldness in communications, sensed that her continued presence was being tolerated rather than welcomed. The October incident had simply provided the excuse they needed to do what they had already decided to do. She also told them, and this was perhaps the hardest admission, that she had nowhere to go. She could not afford to maintain any property that matched her previous standard of living. She had no income beyond book royalties that had been declining for years. And at 66, with a complicated public history, her employment prospects were essentially non-existent. The statement she made next would haunt all three of them. She said quietly that perhaps she should have left the royal orbit entirely after her divorce in 1996. If she had made a clean break then, built a completely independent life, she would not be facing this catastrophic displacement in her late 60s. But she had stayed, hoping for acceptance, clinging to connection, and now she was paying the price for that hope. Beatrice, crying openly, said this was not her mother's fault, that the palace should be ashamed of how they were treating someone who had given so much and endured so much. But Sarah shook her head slowly. Fault did not matter. Fairness did not matter. The institution had decided, and the institution always won. As dawn approached and the December 3rd sunrise began lightening the sky outside, the three women remained in the morning room, exhausted and emotionally drained. In a few hours, the announcement would go public, and Sarah's humiliation would become global news. Millions of people would read about her removal from royal support over their morning coffee, would debate and discuss and judge her fate, without understanding the full complexity of what had led to this moment. The aftermath and fallout. By 9:30 on the morning of December 3rd, the announcement about Sarah Ferguson had circulated through every major news outlet across the globe. The reactions, as palace officials had anticipated, split sharply along geographic and generational lines, creating two parallel narratives about the same event. In Britain, the response was cautiously supportive of the palace's decision, particularly among viewers who remembered the turbulent years of Sarah's marriage and the scandals that followed. BBC coverage emphasized the institutional necessity of the move, bringing on constitutional experts who explained that the monarchy could not maintain informal arrangements that contradicted its stated modernization goals. One analyst noted that Sarah had enjoyed extraordinary tolerance for decades, far more than most divorced royals could expect, and that this decision simply brought her status in line with actual protocol. The Telegraph ran an editorial praising the palace for finally addressing an anomaly that had persisted far too long. The piece pointed out that working royals like Princess Anne had dedicated their entire lives to service while receiving no special accommodation, and that maintaining support for non-working family members created inequities the public was increasingly unwilling to accept. The tone was not cruel, but it was firm, suggesting that sentiment could not override institutional logic. Inside Royal Lodge, Sarah experienced the media storm as a distant background noise to her more immediate crisis. By mid-morning, her phone had become unusable, overwhelmed by calls from journalists, sympathetic friends, curious acquaintances, and even a few cruel individuals who seemed to take pleasure in her downfall. She turned it off completely and asked staff to screen all incoming communications. Beatrice and Eugenie remained with their mother through the morning, trying to manage the practical implications of what had happened. They called Andrew, hoping their father might offer some form of support or assistance, but he was unreachable, apparently having instructed his own staff to decline all calls related to Sarah's situation. His silence, whether motivated by self-preservation or genuine inability to help, felt like another abandonment. The financial implications became clearer as the day progressed. Sarah's lawyer, contacted by Eugenie, confirmed that the palace's decision was legally unassailable. Sarah had no claim to Royal Lodge, no entitlement to continued support, and no realistic avenue for appeal. The lawyer also gently raised the question of Sarah's immediate finances, asking whether she had resources to secure alternative housing. The answer was devastating. Sarah had perhaps £50,000 in accessible savings, enough to sustain her for a few months at most, but nowhere near sufficient to purchase property or even maintain a long-term rental in any area befitting someone of her former status. Her book income had declined to a few £1,000s annually. She had no pension, no investments of substance, no financial safety net. Eugenie, practical and determined, began researching options. She contacted friends in Portugal where she and her husband had connections, exploring whether Sarah might temporarily relocate there while regrouping. She also reached out to charitable organizations Sarah had supported over the years, hoping someone might offer employment or housing assistance. though both daughters recognized the uncomfortable reality that most charities would be reluctant to associate with someone freshly and publicly rejected by the palace. By early afternoon, a more troubling dimension emerged. Several media outlets had begun investigating Sarah's financial history, and stories started appearing about her past debts, the infamous cash for access scandal from 2010, her association with questionable business ventures. The palace's announcement had opened a floodgate, and journalists who might have previously shown restraint now felt free to revisit every embarrassing chapter of Sarah's financial past. One particularly damaging piece appeared in a major British newspaper detailing her current debts, which were apparently more substantial than previously known. Creditors who had remained quiet while she lived at Royal Lodge with implicit royal protection now began making inquiries through lawyers, recognizing that Sarah's removal from palace support might be their last opportunity to recover outstanding payments. Princess Anne, reviewing the coverage from Windsor Castle, felt no satisfaction despite having supported the decision. She had advocated for institutional clarity, not for public humiliation, and watching Sarah's financial vulnerabilities exposed so thoroughly troubled her more than she had anticipated. She mentioned to a senior aide that perhaps the announcement could have been structured to allow Sarah more private time to arrange her affairs before becoming public knowledge. William, monitoring the situation from Kensington Palace, experienced similar discomfort. He had pushed for this decision because he believed it institutionally necessary, but the international coverage, particularly the emotional American response, was more intense and more sympathetic to Sarah than his team had projected. King Charles spent much of December 3rd alone in his private study, refusing most appointments and appearing, according to staff, genuinely distressed by the fallout. He had agreed to the decision because he accepted its institutional logic, but watching it executed so publicly, seeing Sarah's vulnerabilities exposed so comprehensively, weighed on him far more heavily than he had anticipated. He attempted to call Sarah twice during the afternoon, but both calls went unanswered. He sent a brief personal message through a trusted intermediary, expressing regret about the necessity of the decision and offering to facilitate private financial assistance if she needed immediate support. The offer was declined. Sarah sent back a single-sentence response through Beatrice. She wanted nothing from the family that had just publicly cast her out. By evening, the story had evolved beyond simple announcement into something more complex and troubling. International coverage was increasingly framing Sarah as a victim not just of this specific decision, but of decades of institutional coldness and public cruelty. Several major publications ran retrospective pieces examining her treatment since the divorce, highlighting the disparity between how she had been handled versus how male royals who committed far worse offenses had been protected. The question being asked with increasing frequency was uncomfortably direct. Why was Sarah Ferguson, whose worst crimes were financial mismanagement and poor judgment, being treated more harshly than men who had been credibly accused of far more serious misconduct? The palace had no good answer to that question, and the silence from Buckingham Palace throughout the day only amplified the perception that the institution had acted harshly and possibly unfairly. What the future holds. In the days following the announcement, as December progressed toward the Christmas season that would now be forever marked by her public rejection, Sarah Ferguson faced the most difficult question of her 66 years. What happens next when the life you built, however imperfectly, collapses entirely? The immediate practicalities were overwhelming. Royal Lodge, her home for over 2 decades, would need to be vacated by the end of January. Palace administrators, professionally courteous but inflexible, had made clear that the timeline was non-negotiable. The property needed to be prepared for its next use, whatever the royal household decided that would be, and Sarah's continued presence complicated those plans. Beatrice and Eugenie, working with increasing desperation, explored every possible option for their mother's relocation. The Portugal property that had initially seemed promising fell through when the owners, concerned about media attention and associating with someone freshly rejected by the palace, quietly withdrew their offer. Several other potential arrangements collapsed for similar reasons. Sarah's situation had become so publicly known, her circumstances so complicated, that even sympathetic contacts hesitated to become involved. The financial assessment grew more dire with each passing day. Sarah's lawyer confirmed that her debts, once manageable while she lived at Royal Lodge with minimal expenses, would become insurmountable once she needed to secure and maintain independent housing. She owed approximately £200,000 to various creditors, most of them patient thus far, but increasingly insistent now that her palace protection had been removed. Her income prospects were equally grim. Publishing houses that had once welcomed her children's books now politely declined new projects, not because of quality concerns, but because her name had become too controversial, too associated with scandal and rejection. Television opportunities occasionally available in past years disappeared entirely. Producers who might have considered her for programs now worried about backlash from associating with someone the palace had so definitively cast out. The most painful realization came during a conversation between Sarah and her daughters on December 9th. Sitting in the morning room at Royal Lodge, surrounded by partially packed boxes, Sarah acknowledged what they had all been avoiding. She might need to leave Britain entirely. The media scrutiny was too intense, the public recognition too constant, the financial pressures too overwhelming. Staying in the UK meant remaining perpetually under the shadow of the family that had rejected her, a daily reminder of what she had lost. Eugenie mentioned that her husband had connections in Switzerland and that Sarah might find more privacy and less judgment there. The suggestion was made gently, but everyone understood what it represented: exile. Not the formal, dramatic exile of historical royals, but a quiet, sad removal from the country that had been her home for 4 decades. Meanwhile, inside palace walls, the aftermath of the decision continued creating uncomfortable tensions. William remained convinced the choice had been institutionally correct, but the intensity of negative international coverage troubled him. His communications team reported that American polling showed a significant decline in favorable views of the monarchy, particularly among women over 50, who identified strongly with Sarah's plight. The numbers weren't catastrophic, but they represented a measurable reputational cost. Princess Anne maintained her position that the decision had been necessary regardless of public reaction. During a private conversation with Charles, she pointed out that institutional decisions could not be made based on polling or sentiment. The monarchy survived by maintaining clear boundaries and consistent principles. Sarah had never fit within those boundaries, and removing her was simply recognizing reality. But Charles remained troubled. He had spent his entire life navigating the tension between personal loyalty and institutional duty, and this decision felt like one of his most painful surrenders to the latter. He had not spoken to Sarah since the announcement, had received no response to his offer of private assistance, and the silence between them felt heavier than any confrontation might have been. In December 4th, Sarah made her first semi-public statement since the announcement. Through a carefully worded message released by her lawyer, she thanked those who had offered support and sympathy, acknowledged that she would be leaving Royal Lodge as requested, and expressed hope that she might rebuild her life with dignity and privacy. The statement was brief, measured, and notably absent of any bitterness toward the royal family. That last detail surprised palace officials who had prepared for the possibility of public recrimination. Sarah's restraint, whether motivated by genuine grace or strategic calculation, denied the media the conflict narrative they had been hoping for. She was leaving quietly, accepting her fate without public complaint, and that dignified silence somehow made the palace's actions seem harsher in retrospect. The plan for Sarah's future had taken rough shape. She would relocate temporarily to Switzerland in late January, staying with connections of Eugenie's while exploring longer-term options. Her belongings from Royal Lodge would be placed in storage, most of them likely to remain there indefinitely, since she had no permanent residence to move them to. Her life was being compressed into a few suitcases and uncertain possibilities. The financial situation required more drastic measures. Sarah's lawyer negotiated with her creditors, explaining that she had no assets beyond personal possessions and no realistic means of immediate repayment. Several creditors, recognizing that forcing bankruptcy would yield nothing, agreed to long-term payment plans at minimal amounts. Others simply wrote off the debts, accepting losses rather than pursuing legal action against someone with no recoverable assets. The most heartbreaking dimension of Sarah's situation emerged during Christmas week. Beatrice and Eugenie wanted their mother to join them for the holidays, to be surrounded by family during this impossibly difficult time. But Sarah declined, explaining that she could not bear to participate in festive celebrations while her life was falling apart. She would spend Christmas alone at Royal Lodge, her final holiday in the house that had been her home for so long. The monarchy had moved on, already focusing on the year ahead, on new priorities and fresh challenges. For the institution, Sarah Ferguson was now simply history, a footnote in the ongoing evolution of a 1,000-year-old system. But for Sarah herself, the story was not quite over. Somewhere, in whatever life she would build beyond the shadow of the crown, there might still be chapters to write, lessons to learn, perhaps even redemption to find. The palace had released her, but whether that release would prove to be tragedy or liberation remained a question only time could answer.